Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Plant Powered Dog Podcast. I'm super excited today to welcome one of my dog nutrition heroes, Professor Andrew Knight, and he's a pioneer in the world of vegan nutrition for companion animals and has a really long list of credentials in the field. So actually, I think we'd be here all day if I were to list them all. So, Andrew, I'll just run down a few of the highlights. Um, he is professor of animal welfare and ethics at Winchester University in Winchester, England. And he is also the founding director of the University Center for Animal Welfare. He is also an adjunct professor in the School of Environment and Science at Griffith University in Queensland, Australia, a European Board of Veterinary Specialization and Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons veterinary specialist in animal welfare, ethics, and law, an American and New Zealand veterinary specialist in animal welfare, and a fellow of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. But wait, that's not all. Andrew has authored numerous publications, academic articles, and books on animal welfare. And he's also delivered hundreds of presentations and social media videos on vegan diets for companion animals and a variety of issues surrounding aspects of human exploitation of animals. So, that was a lot, right? So the bottom line is that we're really,
It's amazing what you got to do to get a job these days.
yeah, right, to get on my podcast. Yeah. So we are super fortunate to have you with us, and I really appreciate you being here. And I know everyone listening is going to just get so much out of what you have to say. I know I have. We've known each other via phone and email for several years now, and you were actually the very first person I spoke with when I was looking into transitioning my canine nutrition practice from being an animal ingredients based practice to a plant based practice, and was starting my research. And thank God you were the guy I started with, because you gave me so many, epiphanies. So, with that being said, let's kind of a lot of veterinarians focus on the welfare of companion animals, our dogs, our cats, our horses, but you've taken that so much further to encompass all animals. So, how did you get into that area?
I've always been interested in vegetarian and vegan diets myself because of the major impacts that they have on planetary biodiversity, species extinctions, health and well-being of populations, whether they be humans or potentially companion animals as well, and the welfare of farmed animal species. So there are these major impacts that come from our dietary choices. So I've always been interested in that. And as a practicing small animal vet around London for nearly a decade before I went into academia, I was interested in finding out what the evidence was about the health implications of vegan diets for dogs and cats. And at the time, there had been limited studies conducted. So I studied all of those and brought them together and made an informational website about this issue. And only in very recent years has a lot of research attention focused on this field. And other researchers and myself have now been doing sort of large-scale studies looking at health outcomes of dogs and cats maintained on these diets, and also related aspects such as how happy they are to eat these diets. We study behavior at feeding time, and also things like manufacturing processes designed to ensure dietary quality and environmental sustainability as well. So there's been an awful lot of new research coming into this area just in the last couple of years.
Right. And you've had a couple of really interesting new studies come out lately. So, talk a little bit more about what you are finding, because I like also you hit on the behaviors at feeding time. And, one of the major things I hear is, oh, it's not, your dog will be happy eating this. Now, I know what I experience with my canine clients is the opposite of that. But what have you found in your research about, the dog's behavioral patterns, and then also the health outcomes?
So you're right about the concern about behavior. A lot of critics will say, well, we can formulate diets to be nutritionally sound for dogs without use of animal products, but surely it's cruel not to allow these animals to be eating meat because they're carnivores. Well, first of all, they're not carnivores, they're biologically omnivores. They've co-evolved with humans for 20 to 40,000 years, subsisting on scraps from our campfires, particularly starchy cooked root vegetables, and also scraps from hunting parties and all sorts of leftovers from our ancestors. So they have evolved to do well on a very omnivorous diet. And secondarily, when we studied the behavior of really large numbers of these animals at feeding times maintained on meat-based pet food versus vegan pet food, we found that in looking at all known indicators of behavioral palatability, so how happy the animals were to eat their different diets, we found no significant difference between animals on vegan dog food and animals on meat-based dog food. Once we analysed it in great statistical detail and looked at all 10 of the indicators of palatability that had ever been mentioned in the scientific literature, or that we thought from our experience as veterinarians might be relevant as well. This is by far the largest study that's ever been done like this. We looked at more than 2,300 dogs, and so we're very confident in the results, which seem to clearly indicate that if you study the behaviour of dogs in great detail at feeding time, they seem to be just as happy being fed vegan pet food as they are fed meat-based pet food.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I mean, my clients tell me that they lick the bowl clean. Well, the clients don't lick the bowl clean. The dogs do. Sometimes actually the clients do. It's just all, I've actually had clients with gastrointestinal issues tell me that they made themselves the same diet as I formulated for their dog, and they felt a lot better symptomatically, right? Why not? It's just all, great plant foods. But so
Yeah.
you touched on something. So behaviorally, we're not seeing these supposed, differences. They're not crying at food time, right?
Yeah, they
Um,
seem to be just
yeah,
as likely to race up to their food bowls, to jump and bark, to wolf down their food, to guard their food bowls, to display all the signs that they really like and value their food, and just as likely to do that with vegan pet food as they are for meat-based pet food. They don't seem to be suffering at all, quite the contrary, when they're fed these vegan pet foods.
100%. That's what I see. And health wise, what's the story there?
Yeah, health is really exciting. What we are seeing is that uh, these animals seem to be not having any health disadvantages, and also to be experiencing certain health benefits, actually. The most recent study published by researchers from Guelph Vet School in Canada found that on average, dogs on vegan diets were living 1.5 years longer. Um, and we sometimes think of a rule of thumb in veterinary practice that 1 year of a dog life equates to about 7 years of human life. So 1.5 years of extra lifespan would equate to around about an extra decade of life for us at the end of our lifetimes. And imagine, I think, how we would feel if ourselves or one of our family members could live for an extra decade, how much that would mean at the end of our lifespans. And on top of that, these dogs are not just living longer, they're actually living better as well, because they seem to be suffering less from certain clusters of health disorders. They seem to be suffering less from itchy and inflamed skin and ears, which are very discomforting to these animals, gastrointestinal problems, and also they're less likely to be overweight, obese, suffer from mobility disorders as well. So I think they're probably enjoying a better quality of life as well as living longer. So that's ideal. We want them to have a better quantity and quality of life, and that seems to be what they're getting. And it makes sense, I think, if you consider that we're formulating these diets to supply all the nutrients that are needed through supplementation, but without the dietary hazards, which are more common in meat-based pet foods. A particular dietary hazard of concern, I think, is animal-sourced allergens, and in dogs, they tend to cause things like itchy and inflamed skin, ear canals, and lo and behold, we're seeing that dogs on vegan diets have less inflamed skin, less ear canal problems, and so on. So we're seeing benefits associated with the elimination of animal-sourced allergens, and also the hazard of overnutrition, excessive calories, I think is more
Right.
common in the commercial meat-based pet foods. And we are seeing that the dogs on the vegan diets seem to suffer less with being overweight. The same is true of cats actually on vegan pet food as well. So less overweight, less mobility disorders and sequelae such as arthritis. So these seem to be the main sorts of benefits that are coming out when we look at multiple studies, sometimes involving thousands of animals. There seem to be these two distinct clusters of benefits. One seems to be associated with elimination of animal-sourced allergens, and the other one is seems to be associated with less overweight, obesity, mobility disorders. I suspect there are simply too many calories in commercial meat-based pet foods, and that for some reason this is less of a problem with the vegan pet foods.
Well, and that makes total sense, right? And isn't it overweight and obese dogs live something like 2.5 fewer years than dogs of ideal weight, which, as you were pointing out in your translation of that into human years, that's a heck of a lot. And as we know, obesity in dogs and people now leads, dogs are seeing diabetes that they didn't see at younger ages and all sorts of obesity related diseases. So it sounds like a total win-win. You've got me convinced. Obviously, you had me convinced several years ago. So how do you convince people who just continue to insist that dogs are wolves, they're carnivores, their teeth need to rip apart meat? What do you say to them?
Look, I think you can provide sound reasoning and good evidence from large-scale studies of thousands of animals and common sense explanations, such as these animals biologically require various nutrients. They don't have any requirements for any particular ingredients. But if they won't listen to
Right.
all of that, I think there comes a point at which you have to say, it's clear that you're not open to really changing your position, pretty much regardless of the quality of the reasoning or evidence that is provided to you. So I'm not going to waste my limited time on you. I'm going to go and talk to people who are interested in learning new things and have more open minds. There are some people who simply will not be open to new information, new scientific evidence as it becomes available, as it has done very rapidly in this field recently.
So, you touched on this a minute ago, and I think it's worth even discussing it more, the background of what dogs truly ate, because people, like, one of the arguments is that a plant-based diet is unnatural. I would actually argue, based on the research for my book, The Plant Powered Dog, that a species appropriate diet is actually a plant-based diet based on um, dogs following the agricultural farmers in the Neolithic period. And what did they eat? They were eating their, wheat and legumes and things like that. So, you know, can you touch a little bit more on the fact that it's not unnatural to feed a plant-based diet?
I mean, I completely agree with you. Dogs obviously evolved from wolves, and the wolf hybrids that had mutations that enabled them to derive nutritional benefit from the legumes and the wheat, and also the starchy cooked vegetables, which were in their environments around those early campfires as they followed our hunter-gatherer ancestors across the landscape, or were around early farming settlements. The wolf descendants that were able to derive significant nutritional benefit from all those other sources of food did better than the original wolves that did not have those mutations. And because they did better, they outcompeted the others, and over time the population changed into the modern domesticated dog, which is no longer just purely carnivorous like the wolf ancestors, but is actually biologically omnivorous, and hence able to derive substantial nutritional benefit from all those plant-based foodstuffs which were in their early environments. So that's simply adaptation of a species to a changing environment in which it finds itself. Of course, not all wolves changed. It was those wolves that were more confident and had friendlier personalities that were more likely to follow our early hunter-gatherer ancestors and come close to our campfires, and then able to we offer those food scraps to ones that weren't as confident and didn't have as friendly personalities, didn't do those things, and they stayed in the forest and they never changed, and they remain the wolves of today. But the others eventually changed into dogs, and they have a variety of adaptations, physiological adaptations, things like changes in digestive enzymes that enable them to break down starchy food products from plants, changes in their teeth, making them more suited to an omnivorous lifestyle, a variety of adaptations that enable them to derive, as I say, substantial nutritional benefit from a much more varied diet, much higher proportion of plant products. Even the original wolves did consume some degree of plant produce, and that was primarily in the gastrointestinal contents of prey animals that they would hunt and kill. But it's never the case that an animal that we think of as being a carnivore that hunts and consumes other animals doesn't consume any plant material. They do consume plant material, and that is certainly within the gastrointestinal tracts of prey animals, if nowhere else.
Yeah, 100%. And, it's interesting because people have no problem accepting the behavioral evolution from that wolf to the dog who we love today and who sleeps in our bed and watches TV with us and often walks on a leash or goes to the vet. And these are all, sometimes gets carried around in our purse, which, if they're small enough, or in a stroller I've seen. So, that just doesn't seem to be an evolutionary issue that people cling to. We can accept that. So I find it interesting that people have a hard time accepting that, along with behaviorally adapting to be more like humans or more friendly with humans, that they've adapted based on our relationships nutritionally as well. Um, so I always say that if your dog were still a wolf, he'd be eating you. He wouldn't, he wouldn't be in your bed. Yeah, there's nothing worse than an unfriendly wolf, right? Like, it was the ones that were friendly that adapted into the dog. So um I just find that interesting, and so one of the other things people say is, well, okay, it depends on the breed of the dog. But that's not what I've found actually in my research. That it really, adaptation wise, has not been different amongst breeds. What have you found?
There is no breed of dog that has not evolved to derive substantial benefit from legumes, grains, cooked starchy root vegetables, and the other scraps of early human civilizations. There's no breed of dog that hasn't done that. If that were true, it would actually be a wolf. It wouldn't have been associating with our human ancestors. And of course, they're not dogs; they're wolves. So no, this is not true. Dogs have been bred for various different purposes. Maybe some that are more used as guard dogs, as retrieving dogs, and so on. But all of them have been maintained on a diet of scraps from human settlements, which comprised a high proportion of plant materials. Universally across the breeds, that is true.
So we're talking about the benefits of plant-based / vegan diets. Regarding some of the major health dangers on the flip side of that, of animal ingredients, you talked about the potential allergens. I've heard some veterinarians online pull apart commercial vegan diets. And what I found interesting is that, in comparison to what they might be able to pull apart in a commercial vegan diet, if you so choose to want to do that, what you can actually pull apart in a commercial meat-based diet is treacherously, beyond that, based on, I'm going to have you and, kind of elucidate on this, but things that you've taught me based on the rendering industry. And can you talk a little bit more about why, I formulate fresh food diets. Not everyone, for various reasons, can or wants to feed their dog a fresh food diet. So we need to have, high quality commercial foods available. And so if you're comparing a commercial vegan slash plant-based diet with a commercial animal-based diet, what would you say, what would you say about that and some of the hazards that might be in the animal ingredient diet?
Yeah. Um, Based upon the remarkable consistency we're seeing across around about 8 or 9 studies of dogs now, and a small number in cats as well, it seems that there are certain clear clusters of health benefits associated with nutritionally sound vegan diets, and I think they are related to main dietary hazards within the meat-based diets of animal-sourced allergens and excessive calories. But there are others as well that have always been a concern in the meat-based diets, even before all of this evidence emerged about the health outcomes on nutritionally sound vegan diets recently. And the other concerns are related to things like the quality of the ingredients going into the meat-based diets. It seems that around about half of the ingredients by mass within pet food, meat-based pet food, are byproducts and their derivatives. So we're talking about things like meat and bone meal, fats and oils, meat-based broths, but all coming from byproducts, coming from parts of the carcass that are not normally consumed by people because they're of lower quality, considered to be less edible. They might be from carcasses that are condemned as being unfit for consumption by people in the United States, for example, where those rules apply. So there have always been those concerns about a really sizable proportion of the meat-based ingredients being from poor quality ingredients that wouldn't be consumed by people. And then there are also potential hazards, toxins as well. We're talking about things like the preservatives used to preserve some of the ingredients, some of which have been banned in Europe because of the adverse health effects associated with them, but still allowed to be used in the United States, unfortunately. There are concerns about free radicals, trans fatty acids from the reuse of fats and oils for deep frying produce within fast food restaurants that are then sold on as fat blenders. There have in the past sometimes been concerns about the recycling of carcasses of dogs and cats that have been killed because of pet overpopulation into the pet food industry. And it was hoped that that was a thing of the past. But there was a more recent study showing that detectable levels of euthanizing solution were still present in a significant proportion of pet food brands in the United States. So, of course, at very low levels, but nevertheless indicating those sorts of links. There have been other studies showing that DNA from animals such as horses that you might not expect has been turning up in pet food as well. So, and the list goes on. But there are concerns about these other poor quality and potentially toxic ingredients in meat-based pet foods. And those were the ones that we focused on until recently. But as I say, recently, we now have these sizable body of very consistent studies, and some of them very large-scale studies, pointing to two other even bigger problems, which is the problems caused by the animal-sourced allergens and probably excessive calories in meat-based pet food. So that's what I'm most concerned about these days, because the elimination of those in nutritionally sound vegan pet foods seems to be associated with quite a range of really significant health benefits that can increase our quality of life in these animals. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I remember reading from the Environmental Working Group here in the US as well, too, once that they tested, I forget if it was 10 or 12 pet foods for fluoride levels in the bone meals, and discovered levels that were greater than those known to cause bone cancer in growing, I believe, growing boys or growing children. So high level, dangerously high levels of fluoride that could be carcinogenic as well. So it just seems like the list goes on and on and on for potential problems with animal-based foods as opposed to plant-based foods. So that being said, many people like to point out that they feed their dogs organic or pasture-raised meat. And so, and I'm talking about now maybe not people buying commercial foods, but, the raw food feeders, and that's a very large movement, especially here in the US. So what about those people buying, is there such a thing? And what are the implications if you say, well, I'm buying organic or pasture raised meat, my dog doesn't have these potential problems.
Well, if it's organic, then you wouldn't expect to see problems with antibiotic residues, which would be something. But it's still going to go through the processing of pet foods involving the high temperatures and pressures and chemical treatments and preservatives as well, which bring in some of the other hazards and degradation of nutrients. And we're talking about the more fragile nutrients, so not minerals, but rather things like vitamins and amino acids can be damaged and can need supplementation after the processing to try to take account for that. But the chemical preservatives are still going to be an issue. The environmental impacts, I think, are potentially very problematic if you're not using intensively farmed animals, but instead you're using pasture-fed beef. You're just increasing your environmental impacts very substantially by doing that. The study that I'm doing right now is actually quantifying the environmental impacts of meat-based pet food. And it seems that this sector is responsible for a really significant global proportion of all of the impacts of the livestock sector. So we're talking about a significant contribution toward human-generated greenhouse gases, land use, water use, fossil fuels, pesticides, fertilizers, and also things like the numbers of land animals that are being slaughtered for human consumption each year and also for pet food consumption. Because there is a very significant level of non-byproduct use within pet food, and because pet numbers are growing globally and because diets are increasingly becoming premiumized, that is meat-based pet food, the consumption of livestock animals to produce these diets is increasing worldwide each year. So these factors are really significant, and if you're seeking to eliminate toxins within the diet by use of organic or pasture-fed animals, then sure, you might decrease things like antibiotic use, but you can't eliminate some other ones, and you're increasing the environmental impacts because you're no longer producing these animals intensively. So a lot more land and resources and deforestation is being required for them. So there's no getting around it. Meat-based pet foods, unfortunately, are bad for animals. They seem to be less good for our companion animals. They're certainly less good for farmed animals, and they're also bad for the planet as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I know that no studies have been done on what I'm about to ask you, and so you can't make any direct correlations, and I wouldn't, or causations. But in the U.S. alone, 6 million new cases per year are diagnosed in dogs, and I believe that's per the National Cancer Institute or the American Cancer, a major national cancer organization. And not surprisingly, no one seems to be researching a possible connection to canine cancer and these large amounts of meat-based ingredients dogs are eating. But, I know Dr. Richard Pitcairn, too, talks a lot about bioaccumulation of toxins up the food chain in food animals, and persistent organic pollutants. So even if you're feeding your dog a human-grade raw food cow, you still bioaccumulated these toxins up the food chain, not to mention if you're feeding, and like all of the things you talked about in the animal-based pet foods. I mean, do you think that this is an avenue that would be interesting for research to see if a lot of these illnesses, including cancer, could be linked to these diets?
Sure, there does seem to be bioaccumulation, and sometimes it's because these compounds, these unnaturally occurring compounds, and for example, with fish in the oceans, we're seeing more and more heavy metals and PCBs and other organic pollutants. So these are unnatural. Fish have not evolved with them. They're sometimes lipophilic, so they're attracted to fatty tissues. So they get into the tissues of small fish, which are eaten by bigger fish, and so on. And as we go up the food chain, there is this bioaccumulation of toxins. The fish have not co-evolved with these compounds. They haven't developed the mechanisms to excrete them from their bodies, and they're attracted to the fatty tissues, and they just accumulate as fish eat other fish that have certain levels of these compounds, and they concentrate going up the food chain. Now, if animals are being exposed, if our cats and dogs are being exposed to low levels of toxins in their diets, then that's effectively chronic exposure. They're being exposed at least once a day, if not more than once a day, for the durations of potentially their lifetimes, so very long-term exposure. These sorts of exposures may not be sufficient to cause acute reactions, but over the long term, I think there is the potential for tissue changes to occur within the body in response to these foreign compounds. Cancer is a process that often is preceded by non-cancerous tissue changes. And it makes sense to me that something like that could potentially cause tissue changes that could become cancerous. We certainly are seeing higher rates of cancer in dogs and cats in modern times, and these animals are living longer. We know that cancer is sometimes a result, it's associated with old age. Many cancers are. But still, they don't occur on their own. Something is damaging cells, damaging DNA, damaging tissues, and it makes sense that it could be long-term exposure to low levels of environmental toxins, which are not otherwise being detected or causing obvious reactions at the time.
Right, exactly. It's an avenue that I find very interesting research-wise. I'm waiting for some of the large meat-based pet food companies to investigate that. I think I'll be waiting a long time, right? Um,
Yeah,
yeah, but so I hesitate to even bring this up to my audience because I have enough debates over the dog situation, and I never have been a cat nutritionist. I've never focused on cat nutrition, but since it is one of your avenues of expertise, in case somebody's listening, you know, you discuss this a lot. So for those who are interested, what are your views about these plant-based diets for cats, and what have you discovered in your research?
and the same requirements apply to cats as they apply to any species. Biologically, the animals need the nutrients that the species requires, so diets need to be formulated to supply all of those nutrients. That doesn't mean there's any need for meat, of course. Meat-based dog food and meat-based cat food already includes an awful lot of plant material. It's probably the majority ingredient, actually, within meat-based pet food, as well as minerals, vitamins, and various supplements. So these are already in meat-based pet food. In vegan pet food, the same ingredients are used, but even more often, even more supplementation to make sure that all the nutrients are there that are needed by cats or dogs. So providing the diet's formulated to supply all of those, and it's sufficiently palatable so that the cats are happy to eat the food. And our study of more than 1,100 cats looking at 15 behavioural indicators of palatability showed that they seem to be just as happy eating the vegan pet food as the meat-based cat food. So providing they're as happy to eat nutritionally sound diets, you wouldn't expect any problems to arise. And if you're eliminating toxins that might be prevalent in the meat-based cat food, you should see health outcomes just as good or perhaps better than you would see with meat-based pet food. So what studies have been done? There have been 2 so far that have been published looking at health outcomes in cats, and we have another big one forthcoming, which should be published later this year. And across all of these studies, it seems that the cats on nutritionally sound vegan diets aren't doing any worse and are actually doing better in a few respects as well, which is really interesting. The researchers from Guelph Veterinary School studied more than 1,300 cats and published their study in 2021, and that found that the cats on the vegan diets had less gastrointestinal and liver problems, and less problems with body weight disorders as well. And the most common body weight disorder is being overweight or obese. As with dogs, it's one of the most common health problems in cats, and it causes all sorts of problems, including probably reduced longevity as well and reduced quality of life. So it's a really important problem. So the vegan cats were having less problems with being overweight or obese compared to cats on meat-based diets. So they're not always doing the same. Sometimes they're actually doing better, it seems, which
Hmm.
is really interesting.
That is really interesting. So, also, I think what's interesting is I think anyone who has a dog as part of their life, it's pretty obvious when a dog is happy. So, how do you know when a cat is happy? I think it's less obvious. They're not, wagging the tail and barking. How do you measure that their
Oh, well,
happiness?
there are about 15 signs of possibly positive or negative palatability, whether they like or dislike their food. And they might be things like whether they lick their lips, lick their nose, that can be different, whether they drop their food, leave food uneaten, rush up to the food bowl, and so on. So the first thing we did was we looked at how much these behaviors co-varied with one another. And based on that, we were able to identify some as being positive and some as being negative. And for a few of them, we couldn't tell either way. But for most of them, we were able to tell because they varied consistently with each other, that they were positive or negative indicators. Secondly, we looked at how those varied across different diets, meat-based diets versus vegan diets. And once we've done that, we were able to draw overall conclusions, and that was that there was no statistically significant difference overall between the meat-based and vegan diets. The cats in each group seemed to enjoy their food, and there was no detectable difference based upon very detailed study of the behavior of very large numbers of these cats, more than 1,100 cats in this study.
That's very interesting. So, what advice, as we wrap up, have you, can you give us for people who want to transition their dogs away from a meat-based diet, towards a vegan or, like what I call plant-based diet? What can you tell them? Just, how do you get
Yeah,
started?
sure. I guess there's two things. One is absolutely make sure that you're using a dog food which is nutritionally sound, so nutritionally complete and reasonably balanced. So either be purchasing one of the commercial diets if you are attempting to formulate a diet at home. It can be tricky. I would certainly recommend this new book here I just come across.
Oh, yay.
Plant Power Dog. It seems to
Oh,
have, have an awful lot of
I hear it's
data information.
wonderful.
Someone's gone to an awful lot of trouble. It seems to be more than 300 pages. Very weighty
Yeah.
thing there. So if you're into doing quite a bit of research and calculating calories and supplementing all sorts of ingredients yourself, then that would certainly be the textbook to look at. But it is can be challenging and a lot of work. So the easier option is usually to purchase one of the nutritionally complete diets available from the manufacturers. Trying to find a company that seems to have good standards, that's hopefully worked with veterinary nutritionists or other nutritional experts, and can provide some information about the steps that it's taken to ensure nutritional soundness. If the company won't provide any information, won't answer any questions, that should be a red flag and you should be looking somewhere else. So that's the first thing. Try to ensure the diet's nutritionally sound. Secondly, do the transition gradually. Allow the digestive enzymes and the gastrointestinal bacteria a chance to transition gradually onto the new food. That will decrease the chance of any adverse gastrointestinal reactions, such as diarrhea. So even if your dog is very enthusiastic and wants to just bulk down whatever you're giving it, which some dogs are, try to resist that and make the change gradually over a couple of weeks, ideally onto a new diet. That will decrease the chance of any adverse reactions occurring associated with any dietary change.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the biggest mistake that I see in in the online groups and when people come to me. Um, they don't necessarily realize that there are different microbiota, different bacteria in the gut that are used to munch on, meat-based products or high fat, as then there are that munch on the carbohydrates and plant-based products. So you have to give those time to proliferate and get used to it. If you shock the system, sometimes people will say, "Oh, it caused diarrhea," or "My dog got gas." But oh, so how long? Oh, I just changed him over. Ah,
Yes.
yeah, not really such a great idea. So, um, Well, you've definitely given me a lot to chew on, and hopefully everyone else as well who's watching this, and I'm sure that you have. Um, I'm going to put a link. Maybe you can tell us your websites, and then I'm also going to put a link to that under the video. But how can people find more information about you and your research?
So, as the new studies are being published in this area by myself and other researchers, I'm putting them onto my website, which is sustainablepetfood.info. And if people are interested in any of the studies that I've mentioned today, that's where you can find them.
Fabulous. Well, the industry needs you. I mean, there have been surveys done that I think it's about a third of dog and cat guardians would feed their companion animal a plant-based diet if they were confident that this was nutritionally and health-wise the right thing to do. And thankfully, you're out there showing that it indeed is. So your work was critical to my book. I appreciate it so much. And I can't wait to keep spreading all of your research as well. So, Andrew, thank you for joining us here today from sunny England, I hope.
That really is funny.
Really. but I look forward to continuing to talk with you in the future. And once again, thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.